Yeah, I think I delete. Here we are. This is me. I am the captain of Gimps. I am Lord of Gimpia, and I am a philosophical vagabond. For those of you who follow and watch me on Twitch, I have a very small audience, but I love you all. I sometimes stream Soul Calibur 4. I stream, or 4. 6, I can't read Roman numerals. Actually, I think I kind of have dyslexia. Um, haven't been diagnosed, but it's been an issue. What was I gonna say? I smell more Mexican food being cooked, so it's distracting. I am the Lord of Gimps, and I am here to do the thing that this says. I am here to talk about disability issues. Today, I have a list of questions submitted by friends of mine, by people who watch me, who know me in real life, all that sort of thing. And today, I'm going to get to those. That's what this stream is primarily going to be about. If we have time and I don't have anything else to do, we can read another article or something like that, because I wouldn't mind. Let me tag a couple people in the stream because they specifically asked that I do. And I want to remember to do that before I get to... Oh, what? It's not letting me, man. Oh, okay, here we are. Just so you guys know, I'm going to be cutting these VODs into clips and releasing them as probably separate questions on YouTube. So, don't worry about that too much. I'm almost afraid to look at my Facebook comments right now. Let me do that real quick. Alright, so here's what we're going to do. Originally, what I was trying to do was put the questions in Restream captions, but there's not enough space in the Restream captions to make that happen because they're too awesome. So what I did, I had to throw them all in Notepad real quick. So we're gonna share that instead because that's the way that it worked best. Hopefully you guys don't mind. Alright, let me take a look at what this is like on freaking Twitch, actually. Just to make sure everything's going okay. Streaming is hard, dudes. I don't know if you guys know this. Streaming is difficult to get properly down. Like, to this day, when I try to stream a video game, sometimes you still can't hear me because every game is kind of different. I just want to make sure you still can't hear me because every game is kind of different. I just want to make sure every game is kind of different. Apparently, you guys can't see. Okay, you guys can't see the. Okay. Let me check that now. Okay, we're good. We're good. All right. On to business. What was I doing? Okay, now I have to be able to see everything. Okay. All right, so we're going to start at the top and work our way down. So someone wrote in and asked, do you feel like people underestimate you? If so, in what kind of ways do they underestimate you? A couple of different really common ways, I would say, are the fact that people assume that I have some level of cognitive impairment because of the way I look. Because, there's a strong association with certain physical manifestations of mental retardation as a diagnosis. They don't use that term anymore, but when I was growing up, they did. There's a certain association with certain physical characteristics when it comes to cognitive difficulty like that, because of movies like Little Nicky and Waterboy and things like that. So people tend to assume that I have some kind of intellectual impairment, when in my case I don't. Um, with cerebral palsy specifically, that can happen depending on the nature of the cerebral palsy and how severe. So, for example, spastic CP is fairly common, but spastic CP without any kind of cognitive difficulty can be kind of rare because a lot of those cases are caused by lack of oxygen at birth, right? And that tends to have physical and mental aspects to the way it affects someone. Not always, but it can. Um, so it's not like it's uncommon, but it's something that people automatically assume. So people will, since we supposedly value intelligence very highly, although I would say there are cultural forces that kind of contradict that, but supposedly we do. People tend to assume that I don't have that, and therefore it's fine to think whatever you want about me. The other one that's very common is that I can't do any kind of work. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've been on job interviews and applied for jobs where I've been turned down just because the hiring manager assumes that I can't do the job and is unwilling to explain why they don't think I can. So that's a thing. And technically, when you do that, you can argue that you're not discriminating, that you just thought it would be unrealistic for someone in that position to be able to adequately perform the job, and that wouldn't be considered discrimination because that is left up to the hirer's discretion. But it happens all the time, and a lot of employers do not give adequate justification for things like that. So it's something to be aware of. Another thing is that since I'm in a wheelchair, people assume I'm paralyzed, and on top of that, they make another assumption about people with paralysis, that people with paralysis can't have sex. They might not have sensation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their equipment doesn't work, dude. I mean, it doesn't mean that at all in a lot of cases. Just saying. So those are some common things that I deal with on a regular basis. And I've noticed, if I'm being completely real, that's developed some unhealthy mental habits in me. One of them is that I feel like I have to try harder to be acknowledged as a person in a lot of situations, academically, professionally. When I was growing up, I even felt that way in my family, if I'm being honest, even though I don't think they were aware of that. That's how I felt. I don't really feel like that now around my family, but like that's something that happened when I was growing up. The next question, do you think there is still work discrimination based on disability, in that disabled people are underrepresented in the workplace? If you've been listening to my previous answer, if you're watching this separately, you know what? For editing's sake, I'm gonna go ahead and highlight these from now on, so that when I clip them, I know which question I'm on. I just thought of that. The hazards of live streaming, guys. Anyway, let me reread this question for myself. Do you think there's still discrimination based on disability? Still work discrimination based on disability, in that disabled people are still underrepresented in the workplace? The short answer to that question is resounding yes. The longer form answer is a complex one, and I am really not aware of all the issues at play, but what I can tell you is that as of the last statistical tally on disability unemployment, only 30% of working age disabled adults are employed. Think about that. So that means 70% of adults with disabilities that are of working age are unemployed. Um, One of the factors that is legitimate at play, and when I say legitimate, I mean this argument is difficult to defeat. Some people are physically or mentally impaired to the degree that employment is extremely difficult. Like um, some disabilities entail um, severe emotional dysregulation, which can be debilitating for the person experiencing it, and it's very hard for employers to figure out how to deal with it. There are people that are physically unable to move. I'm going to address the caveats to these in a second. But um, by the way, if you're on Facebook, please DM me. It's a lot easier because Facebook is the one chat that I can't see incoming messages from. Uh, just to let you guys know. So another practical so there are some people that physically or mentally cannot work what I would consider an average job. That being said, I don't think that in a lot of cases where this is applied, that is a good excuse. So, for example, I have a quad friend who was trying really hard to get any job, but since she's quadriplegic and has spastic CP and severe muscle spasms to the point where they put a baclofen pump in her back so that she could have a continuous flow of baclofen as needed. Baclofen is an antispasmodic, aka muscle relaxer. For those of you who don't know what those are, like, I don't blame you. So here's the thing. She was trying to work an office job, and they were like, well, WTF, dude. You can't even freaking type, dog. I'm paraphrasing to be funny, but, like, this was a legitimate thing that they told this person. And she was like, well, have you ever heard of Dragon Naturally Speaking, right? It's a dictation software. The plugin works very well with current versions of Microsoft Office, and you can do many, many things in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Microsoft Access with this dictation software, right? And they were like, what is that? Do you mean the Windows dictation? And she was like, no. And then she tried to explain to them what it was. They looked it up, and they determined arbitrarily that it would be too expensive. Mind you, this specific company is a company that makes several $1 million a year, and the license for a professional version of the software is $300, and it's perpetual. The only thing that happens at the point that the license for Dragon Naturally Speaking expires is that Dragon, Nuance rather, the company behind Dragon, is not required to support it, like give you tech support for it. But the software will work indefinitely. In fact, I'm still using a really old version because of that. So there's situations like that where I would argue that is discrimination blatantly, because, I mean, if you're unwilling to make what I would consider reasonable accommodation, right? And here's the problem with the ADA. Reasonable accommodation is very, very poorly defined. And it's largely left up to the discretion of the employer where private employers are concerned. So this employer determined that it would be an undue hardship, right? You make several $1 million a year in net profit, and $300 for a software license is undue hardship. I think that's complete garbage, but it happens. Another thing that happens often happened to me. I've talked about this on a previous stream, but since this came up as a question, I thought I would address another way that disabled discrimination can appear in the workplace, right? So I've already talked about the statistical trash heap of unemployment, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities. The other concern that I have is what happens is sometimes interviewers will lie in order to not hire you unless they can't afford to do that. So what do I mean by that? So let me present two contrasting situations that actually happened to me. The first one is blatant. So I'm going to call them out for this, right? So this is when I was 18. I'm over it, but I think it's important to share. California Family Fitness is known for being a family-friendly gym that has a children's play area for kids, while parents and appropriately aged adolescents go work out, and you can sign your kids in and pick them up when you're done. Ugh, bitter coffee. Oh, so I'm 18 years old. I'm just out of high school. I'm feeling like kind of naively optimistic about the world. I'm like, yeah, it's time for me to get a job. I just registered to vote. The Army called me wondering why I haven't shown up for selective service. And I had to explain to the Army recruiter what my disability is, so they stopped calling me because they called me like 6 times. The Marines called me a couple times. The Navy called me, but they understand what CP is. The Army called me 3 times, and they did not understand what CP was, and they kept calling me. But I was like, okay, I did that. Let me go get a job. So I go to, because this is where we used to go to the gym. And, I used to go hang out with my brother and sister when they were in the play place because I was concerned with how some kids were treating them. And plus, they had like Dreamcast and N64, and my brother wanted to show me games. So I was like, I could probably do this job. Like, I noticed like there's a lot of cool people here. Most of the kids are fairly well behaved. This doesn't look that difficult. I chase kids around the whole day anyway. So I apply. And they bring me in for an interview. And right away, I don't remember this lady's name. I remember her face very well. She probably doesn't work there anymore. This was years ago. But I could tell something was off right away. And there was something weird about her demeanor. It was like she had to think about every line before speaking. And usually, when an interviewer does that, either A, they're not that practiced, or B, they're trying to censor themselves. And one of the things that I watch for in an interview is whether or not somebody's censoring cognitive bias. I'm fine with cognitive bias. Everyone has them. But when you try to censor cognitive bias, it leads to some really weird situations. So that's what this lady was doing. I was already like, alarm bells were ringing off in my head. She said, okay, we need to have you take a cashier's test, cashier's test, right? Not that you'll be dealing with money, but like it's something we have to do to everyone we hire. I'm like, oh, that's fine. So it's really basic math, like simple addition and subtraction. And like, okay, so I can make mistakes in math, but dude, the likelihood that I would make mistakes in that type of math is fairly low, dude. Like, my IQ at the time was like 135. So I take this test. I'm pretty sure I nailed it. I have a pretty good memory at the time because, this is before I got into like some substance use issues. So my mind was pretty sharp. And I take the test. I'm pretty sure I nail it. She tells me, she comes back after like reviewing the test and tells me that I got too many wrong. And then I ask her which ones, and she's like, I'm really not supposed to show you, but here they are. I remembered the problems. I went outside and I did them on my calculator, and every single one of them was correct. But it's my word against hers. I have no proof. For all I know, like, and I'm 18, dudes. Like, I just got out of high school and started school at ITT Tech, right? And so, like, dude, I felt defeated, man. So, yeah, I definitely think that A, there is still discrimination happening, and B, discrimination doesn't always look like discrimination. A lot of times, what employers will do is present it as a reasonable argument for undue hardship so as not to have to make um, reasonable accommodation for one employee. And so, my point of view on that is a 30% employment rate is too low for any segment of the population to be considered fully participatory in our society. And one of the goals of the ADA was to remove those type of discriminatory barriers based on disability. Has it succeeded? Yes and no. This would be an example of the no. Alrighty then. On to the next question, my dudes. This one comes from a very good friend of mine. She asked the best questions. Well, actually, you all ask really great questions, but I love this question. Have you ever had to keep your disability secret in any way in society in case it would prevent an opportunity? Yes. I forgot about the second scenario I was going to share. It actually applies to this question as well. So the point of contrast to the last scenario, the last question was a scenario where there were definitely discriminatory attitudes, but that didn't necessarily prevent me from getting hired. So let me tell you guys something. As someone with a disability, right? When I give a resume, I am one of those people who choose not to disclose my disabilities or conditions because I have found what has been shown to be statistically true, that if you send a resume with the exact same qualifications to an employer, where the only difference is whether or not the individual discloses disability, you are statistically far less likely to get a response than if you do not disclose. So I don't disclose because I generally get more of an opportunity by not disclosing. So let me give you a scenario where that happened. I was in my mid-20s, and at the time I was a web developer, right? So I was applying for web development jobs, and there was one that looked particularly interesting to me because it involved WordPress. I know, comma, but I did anyway, period. I'm doing an AMA stream right now, smiley face. Anyhow, so the job was work from home, and it was WordPress, and I'd been using WordPress for 3 years personally up to that point, and I had implemented WordPress as a content management system for a few clients, and I was pretty familiar with it, and I was confident that even though it had been a few years since I had used it in that way, I could still do it because I was still actively maintaining a blog for my writing, and I was doing a lot of back-end work for that, and I'm like, well, it's basically the same. So I apply for the job, I do the phone interview, they really like me. Of course, I sent them my resume, and they wanted to meet me in person and do an in-person interview, which is cool, and I'm like, okay, by the time you get an in-person interview, something has to really go wrong for you not to get the job. Right? So I go, and I do the in-person interview, and this is a husband and wife team. The husband was some sort of stage performer, right? Who did shows on college campuses for for money. He was a magician, illusionist, mentalist. It was really cool stuff, and I enjoyed the work for the most part. There were some problems, but it had nothing to do with being disabled. But the wife ran the business side, and he did all the performing. And The first thing both of them said is, like, you're not what I expected. And I'm like, oh, I know. I'm a lot more dashing than you originally assumed I would be, right? And they laughed. And they literally said, no, what I meant was that, like, on the phone, you seemed so normal. And I made a joke about that too. I said something about, well, Steve Jobs said, here's to the crazy ones, right? Here's to the ones who march to the beat of their own drum. And so that went over well. They ended up hiring me. But my point to you is people have these preconceptions, and some people can't really hide them. And my stance has always been, regardless of how hard you try, the way that you think will always inevitably affect how you interact in the world. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I mean, that's a very long winded answer to the second half of the first question. And let me tell you about hiding disability in another context. And that context is dating. This goes to another question later, uh, which is also this one. Wait, let me. So I'm going to do the second half of the one that's already highlighted and this one right here, right? How do you handle romantic relationships? Not well. So, in order to illustrate this point, let me go back to high school for a second when a lot of us start experimenting with dating and trying to learn what it is we like as human beings in a partner, right? So I had a really weird friend back in the day. And that friend used to give out my phone number to random girls in an attempt to help me, I don't know, get laid or something. And there used to be these weird, like, chat lines that you could call and, like, randomly speed date via messaging, and then you could choose to, like, press a button and connect live to that person, have a conversation with them, at which point you could, like, give your phone number and you guys could talk and meet up. This was before the internet dating world was a big thing. In fact, this chat line was actually found out to be really dangerous in later years. It was called Biosphere and has since been shut down. But so when I would try to go up to a girl in real life, I would get a lot of uh you're just not my type. You're a really great guy, but you're just not my type. Or, like, on the extreme end of the spectrum, I get you. You're in a wheelchair. Why would I want to do that? By contrast, the thing about the biosphere, right, or any, like, really any internet dating, if you're thinking about it, 100% realistically, like, people really have no idea what you actually look like, right? And I found that often worked to my advantage. What I found was that after people got to know me for a little bit, by the time we met up, they genuinely didn't give a damn that I was in a wheelchair. They didn't care about my CP. They didn't care about any of that stuff because by that time they already understood the person attached to the condition. And I found that my dating results were most favorable where images were not the first way you're introduced to somebody. So with that, how do I handle romantic relationships? Rather poorly because, if I'm being real, there's not all that much opportunity, and COVID only compounds that. Like before COVID, I was sort of dating, and then after COVID, like it was even less than it was before. Um, and this is just my personal experience, but I've come to understand that like people that are younger tend not to have very many preconceived notions about disability. And when they're older, one of two things tends to happen. Either they auto exclude you because they want very specific things from a partner and they don't think someone with a disability can do that. Or the other thing that happens is um, they fall into a caretaker role and they get really involved in taking care of you. And if I'm being totally honest, neither of those things are things that I personally want in a relationship. To me, relationship is about one is about fit, but the other one is like about how you relate to each other. And I really don't want a partner who thinks it's their job to take care of me, because I think it is our jobs in a partnership to care for one another. So yeah, that's pretty much what I could say about that. Like, if you want to talk about like specifically about sex, to me, like that is a completely different question. And if you want to have that discussion, I'm totally down. But if I'm being honest, like I have to do some research before I can talk intelligently about that. Like outside of my own experience to present a broader perspective. But that's definitely a stream I'm planning in the future. Um, I hope that helps. I know who wrote this question. I adore this person. I think they're freaking amazing. And congratulations on all your wonderful success. Um, let's see, what's the next question? So I answered the okay, yeah, okay. Okay. I know this person too. This one's definitely a Kevin question. Um, do you ever wish for someone to have a disability? So there could be more awareness or more love and respect for disabilities. Um, not wishing a disability on someone because of hate, but to try to better understand the circumstance. So this is something I kind of touched on. The short answer to that is sometimes yes. Usually when that happens, I'm experiencing a depressive spiral, some sensory overload, and I'm in danger of like going into meltdown territory. But that's kind of besides the point. But like I've actually done this with people, right? So there have been several periods in my life where someone close to me has said something extremely idiotic to me about how I should live. And it's not like, oh, they just have a different point of view on the same thing. It works for them. So why are you getting mad? It's because they don't have a different point of view, because they have a point of view that doesn't come from the place of living with a disability, right? So these people are able-bodied, ambulatory, like quote unquote normal, and at various points they've criticized how I do things, and sometimes in romantic relationships. So what I do when these situations arrive is literally, I have a wheelchair that I no longer use in the garage. I'll clean it up. I'll put a cushion on it. I'll give it to them and say, here, you think you can do better than I do? Take this chair and use it for a week. And they're like, a lot of people are like, well, I can't. And I'm like, why? Well, because I don't know how to get my chair in and out of the car. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to make you do that. Like, just stand up, right? Get the chair out of the car, sit down in it, and roll into your job. And they're like, what if people look at me weird? right? And I'm like, bro, people look at me weird every day. Let's just do this. And they're like, it makes me really uncomfortable. So let's talk about some of the things that these people have reported to me. Um, if you're a woman, people have reported to me that like um, people who are attracted to them tend to have a more predatory look in their eyes than when they are walking around. Um, they tend they people universally, whether men or women, tend to have more of a pitying set of mannerisms around them. People tend to assume like you're paralyzed because I guess that's what people know the most about, or think they know the most about, rather. Um, Generally speaking, the trend is that people treat you differently. And people who know that they walk around, they're like, oh, why the hell are you in a wheelchair right now? And they were like, well, my friend got mad at me, or my boyfriend got mad at me. So, like, um, he said I didn't understand what it was like to be in a wheelchair. And, like, I thought about it, and truthfully, I really didn't. So, this is what I'm doing. And those people get really curious. The people who know the person out of the wheelchair, like, get super curious. People that don't know, just, like, they treat you like they probably would anybody else in a wheelchair. Whatever those preconceived biases that they have are, those become active, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I've done that for that reason. Like, I don't think it's possible for somebody that doesn't have a disability to completely understand what it's like to be in that position, but I think that facilitating these kinds of experiences is an extremely important thing, because I think that it builds direct empathy. And pardon me for expressing an opinion about COVID-19, but I think it's kind of related here. Um, there are people that I know that refuse to wear a mask because they're either A, uncomfortable, B, they think it's sheep-like behavior, or C, they generally don't care and think it's stupid. And some of those people have been affected by COVID-19 and now are the first people that I see trying to tell others to wear masks. And so the point I want to make with bringing that up is not to slam people, but I want to say, like, don't be the person that needs something bad to happen to you to finally try to understand a point of view other than your own, right? Like, cognitive empathy is a very valuable tool. I call that simulated or VR empathy. Like, it's where you sit down and you really think about, like, you really try to emotionally, like, put your head in a space where you've imagined something different from your own experience so vividly that you begin to feel emotions toward that situation. It's a very important exercise, and I recommend everybody do it. But in the absence of being able to do that, if you're a dude who uses a wheelchair, a girl who uses a wheelchair, or somebody on crutches, and people are criticizing you, give them crutches, put them in a wheelchair for a week, a couple weeks, a month even, and let them really live a bit of your reality, right? I think experiences like that are totally, totally invaluable. All right, next question. This is a pretty good one. E-Man, I appreciate you, my dude. I really do. This is a very broad question, a very simple question with a very complex answer. The short answer is that realistically, you can't completely know. You can't really understand. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try, because trying facilitates deeper communication. Right? So like I was talking about with the above question, when you put someone in a simulated experience, they begin to understand, like, why sometimes the other person might get frustrated, why might feel a certain way about a certain kind of situation. They start to see the various challenges that this person might be dealing with, and then they're like, yo, dude, like, for example, with the wheelchair thing, Like, what do you do when like people keep trying to push your wheelchair and you don't want them to, right? Or like, what do you do when people look at you like you're pitiable, but at the same time you're a piece of meat? These are very difficult questions, right? What do you do when people look at you weird because of how you eat, right? Because maybe you're leaning over because the table's too low and you're used to sitting in a lower chair or whatever at a restaurant. And these are the kinds of things that, like, to me, lead to actual empathy and like a real connection. So leading into that, what is the best way to get people to understand one's disabilities or any other conditions? Um, I'm going to address it like this. I'm going to put it as you guys are the person asking me this question. Like, how can I best understand someone's condition or disability? Because this person is important in my life. I'm going to assume that, like, we're talking about someone important. The advice I would give you, like, start by reading Wikipedia or like any, start with Wikipedia and then check it against like Mayo Clinic or the physician's desk reference as just a starting point, right? So you get the very basics down, maybe watch a couple YouTube videos and read a memoir of someone with that condition, right? And then go to your friend and start having conversations about the things that you're learning. Because it's one thing to learn the symptoms, right? And it's another thing to try to like define someone by the symptoms and not try to understand their experience. So I think ultimately it has to come down to a willingness to try to understand the actual experience of the condition. But the first thing you want to do is like start asking questions and doing really basic research and then have a meaningful conversation. You may discover that you feel the same way about different things, right? So maybe like here's an example of something I often hear. So maybe you spend time in a wheelchair and like you start getting self-conscious in a way that you've never felt before. But then it reminds you of when you were a kid and you used to have like this massive cowlick and some buck teeth and you used to worry about how people were looking at you. And then you're like, oh, now I understand why you're really insecure when you go up to talk to new people. Like, maybe I can do something to help you out with that, right? And this is the kind of thing that we have to get to, I think. Oh, wait, I forgot a question. Hold on, let me throw another question up in here. I totally freaking forgot it. Another question reminded me of a question I was supposed to have. Apparently, I didn't go high enough in the stack. I gotta scroll down just a tiny bit. Where you at? Because there's two questions about use of language and terminology that I want to address individually. And together, for that matter. You know what? Let me throw this in. Okay. Okay. So I kind of want to address these sort of individually, but I also want to talk about them together. And that would be these two questions right here. Let me highlight this for editing's sake. So the first question is, how can we better use inclusive language around people who have disabilities? I see her trying to do that right now. What is inclusive language in terms we should or should not use or say? And the other question is, what's your take on people first language versus identity first language? I'm pretty neutral when it comes to When it comes to describing myself, I use both interchangeably, but I'm fascinated with how it's evolved over the past few years. So I'm I really feel like the way society is shaping, I feel the need to preface this with the fact that um, I do not and cannot speak for everyone with a disability. Everyone has their own preferences. Please, the first thing I want to say is ask that person. Um, for me, it depends on what you mean by inclusive language. All right, so let me do a thing and look that up on Wikipedia just so we have a common definition, right? And I'm going to do the same thing for people first language. Or person centered language is another way that it's referred to commonly. 1 second. So let me read this quick definition. Inclusive language aims to avoid offense and fulfill the ideals of egalitarianism by avoiding expressions that express or imply ideas that are sexist, racist, or otherwise biased, prejudiced, or degrading to any particular group of people, and sometimes animals as well. Um, and to clarify, like the offshoot bit of that to person-centered language versus identity-first language would be like me calling myself like autistic versus a person with autism. Person with autism or people experiencing autism or persons with disabilities is an example of the usage of person-centered language. It's a type of inclusive language, right? And then identity-centered language is like autistic, or like me. I call myself Captain Gimpy because I'm also Gimpy. So what do I think? It depends on the era. So when I was a kid, there was a thing, and I mean, some people still use it. What? Okay. Uh, hmm. I guess I should say I have conflicting feelings because on the one hand, I grew up saying like thinking that like disabled was the correct term of self-reference when talking generally about like people with disabilities, right? As opposed to crippled, which was an older term that turned derogatory. Same thing with the word gimpy. Gimp is also a BDSM suit thing, but not related in usage. But that's a thing. So for me, it doesn't really matter. Although, like, let me say something about that. So generally speaking, it doesn't matter to me if you call yourself a wheelchair user or like say you're in a wheelchair or whether you say you're gimpy or whether you say you are paralyzed or have paralysis or whatever. Because to me, that's completely up to you. There are certain things that I personally don't like. So, for example, I went to school in the 80s, like that was my elementary era, right? Like I was born in 83, I was in elementary school till I was 12, so that was like 1985. And I think I did the math right. Um, and during that time, and there's still parents who do this, we were told not to like refer to ourselves as disabled and to say like we're physically challenged or mentally challenged or experiencing other types of difficulty. And like I understand the psychology behind it, but for me, it ignored the reality of like some of the things that I have to deal with on a daily basis, first of all. And second, it felt condescending because I was being told not to use a word that I was entirely comfortable with using. So you're telling me that basically that I'm too stupid to decide how to refer to myself. And that is what made me angry, right? I understand that some people feel that words like disabled or gimpy or like, um, those sorts of things. Like, I knew a dude that literally had mental retardation who would say, I am retarded. And, like, he's like, no, I'm serious, I am retarded, right? Like, because this is how, he's like, I don't want to say that I have retardation because, like, dude, like, it's hard. So I just tell people I am retarded. And, like, who am I to tell this guy not to say that? Like, who are you as an outsider to tell someone else that they shouldn't refer to themselves that way? And, like, mind you, he didn't think of that in a negative way. He thought of it as a fact, right? And he was like, no, dude, like, it's just what I have to deal with, dog. And I'm like, who am I to tell you to stop then? So for me, like, it's been really interesting to, like, see how all these different language usage paradigms have tried to essentially legislate um, spaces they have no business legislating when it comes to people and how they refer to themselves, right? Like, you have every right to be upset if your kid has some cognitive difficulty and someone calls them retarded. That's not what we're talking about here. But if your kid grew up and decided to be like, Mom, I'm retarded, and here's why I use that word and not say I have retardation or cognitive difficulty. I mean, crap, it might just be because he thinks the word sounds better and it's easier to say. I've literally met people who've made that choice for that reason, or similar choices. For me, I call myself Captain Gimpy because I think it's hilarious and it's a good conversation opener about disability in general. Because people generally think it's funny too. And I'm cool with making jokes about myself. My sense of humor is either really morbid or self-deprecating. So the one thing I want to say is don't try to tell people how to refer to themselves. That's one thing that you should not do. Another thing that you should be aware of are generally bad things. Like, for example, there are certain things that you shouldn't call certain ethnic groups, right? And I'm not just talking about the really obvious one, but there are others. Like, we don't use those words anymore, A, because they sound dumb, and B, because they are dumb. So if you avoid those and you make a mistake and somebody gets upset, be like, oh, my bad, how would you prefer that I talk about that? Because it's going to vary widely from person to person. Some people like me genuinely don't care. Other people care very much how they're referred to, right? I tell people, just don't call me a retard because that's a dumbass word unless you're, talking about a specific act and not a person, to me. And don't call me an asshole unless I deserve it. And, like, the same goes for pretty much anything else. But that's just my take on it. Please be aware that, like, everybody's going to have their own take. Next question. And I think that is, do you, good sir, get asked anything that you don't like? The answer used to be yes. When I was a kid, the way that kids often ask about people in wheelchairs, literally because they don't know any better, is like, what's wrong with your legs, right? Instead of, how come you're in a wheelchair, they'd be like, oh, what's wrong with your legs? I used to hate that. But, like, as I've gotten older, like, the list of questions that I don't like being asked about disability has basically gone to zero. So I haven't really had to handle this situation. Before, I used to handle it pretty badly because I was a kid. Generally now, I try to think, like, first of all, if someone's being mean by the way they ask a question, and they know they're being mean, and it's pretty clear to you that they know, that's one thing, right? But if someone's asking a question using the only kind of language they understand how to use, but they genuinely seem curious, I just try to take it that way. I don't really get offended by questions. I get offended by people assuming they know my answers. Because you don't. I guarantee you don't. Unless you're watching this, you don't know any of my answers. Because I have weird answers, and they're not necessarily typical. They're not necessarily common. Um, so yeah, I basically addressed this question earlier. Oh, I think I posted this twice. Yeah, I did. Oops. Bam. Live streaming mistake. Um, Tell us more about your condition and any misconceptions of it. I would love to. So I have a couple things. Kaiser refuses to diagnose me, but I'm pretty sure I have ADHD. I'm autism spectrum. I have cerebral palsy, and at 28, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. I assume you want to know about the CP. I could talk about the other two, or the other, whatever, three. But let's start with CP. So, cerebral palsy is a condition that is most often caused by one of three things. Either cerebral hemorrhaging, otherwise known as a stroke. I don't know why they don't call it a stroke, but that's kind of what it is, right? Too much oxygen or oxygen deprivation, either in utero during birth or shortly after birth. In my case, it was due to the cerebral leaking of a blood vessel, aka the hemorrhage, right? And that affected all four of my limbs. After a few surgeries, I was downgraded to cerebral palsy spastic diplegia, which means the type of CP I have is spastic CP, which means my muscles be stiff, and diplegia means affecting two limbs, although realistically it affects three. But they don't do triplegia because my left hand isn't so good as my right, which is why I can't touch time. Like I said earlier, people have a lot of misconceptions. People assume necessarily that because you have cerebral palsy, you also experience mental retardation. That is sometimes the case, but it's often not true. Let me. So for some people, they won't be able to speak. For some people, speech hurts because of the degree they experience muscle spasticity. So they also experience spasms in areas of the body which control vocalization, and it hurts to speak literally. Some people cannot speak, so they use I forgot what those are called. Those like voice box things, like the Stephen Hawking thingy, right? Speech synthesizers. That's the word. Yeah, some people use speech synthesizers. But even in those cases where you would assume because they cannot speak, they must be experiencing some form of mental retardation. Like, I've known people who are incredibly smart, like smarter than me. Like if it weren't for the way in which their CP manifested themselves, they would have been put in all gifted programs, hands down, right? And so there's that to keep in mind. Another misconception people have is that it's genetic. There are studies that show that certain genetic disorders are common in people that have CP, but it's because those conditions affect fetal development in general and have nothing to do with CP itself, right? So there's that factor, but CP is not genetic, and most of the time, people with CP don't have any other genetic disorders. But I met one dude who was a youth group leader, really cool guy. Ruben, if you're out there, dude, I hope you're doing well. Stay safe in the time of COVID. Um, he and his wife both had dominant genes for various genetic disorders, and they didn't know until they had children. Um, but they were very smart, very caring people, and both of their children, so far as I know, have gone on to live very healthy lives as young adults, and that made me super happy to hear. So it's not genetic. That's the second misconception. The third misconception is that it's a kind of paralysis. It is not a kind of paralysis, right? What it is, it's a neurological condition that affects motor function primarily. So that means like sometimes you'll see people with CP that have like a myoclonic jerk, like they're having like little mini tics, right? Like their arms will flail all over the place. Sometimes their mouth will swing open without like wanting to, and sometimes it's very painful. So it's a motor coordination. Primarily, it's a motor coordination disorder. Let me think about some other misconceptions. Or should I talk about the other things? So autism, I guess, is weird, right? Because everybody on the spectrum is completely different. And that's been my experience, and that's like what makes autistic relationships difficult is that if you're both on the spectrum and you both have different needs, like in terms of like structure and routine, sometimes even though you really care for each other, those things can clash. So like I can only really talk about my own experience of it. So my experience of it is like this. Sometimes I'm hypersensitive to certain audio-visual stimulus, so like I have to like it's kind of like the sensitivity that comes with a migraine, but without the searing pain, right? So sometimes I have to like lower things or turn certain kinds of sounds up to drown other ones out. Um, the routines that I have for myself don't often look like routines to other people, but I get upset when people disrupt those. So if you see me randomly leave a room because you did something, like don't feel bad. I'm just trying not to react in a bad way. The other thing was like the reading of social cues, right? It's a very common one that gets thrown around, and like it's real, but it also ties into another misconception that people often have about autism. So I want to address those individually, but realize they're connected. The first one is that reading social cues is hard, dude. Like if you've ever tried as a young male or young woman to figure out whether or not somebody liked you and you were wrong one way or the other, imagine that happening with everything or damn near everything. And so I think like some people have enough experience of social awkwardness to understand how difficult it actually is to read social cues when you stop to think about how intricate they are and the message that all communication together um, can make, and like how you can easily misperceive that. So for people on the spectrum, it's often easier just to be 100% literal, and which is why we often communicate that way. Like I learned a lot about metaphor because I used to write like a lot of poetry, which is where I learned how to use metaphor and simile. So that made things a lot easier. And then, like, I had people explain sarcasm to me. I read books on psychology back in the 80s as a kid because I was trying to decode people. 80s and 90s, I should say. I was trying to decode people. Largely, I think I've succeeded at what you would now call in today's disability community language at performing normativity in that regard. But one thing I don't talk about is how exhausting that is. Like, if you put me in a social situation, I am kind of naturally extroverted. Like, I like to be around people that I think are cool. If I don't think you're cool, then chances are I'm not going to want to be around you at all. Um, but I think that's true of anyone. It's just like I'm in my 30s now, so I don't really feel the need to like pretend that I want to be around someone that I don't. When I was in my 20s, that was a very different story, and in my teens. But it's exhausting. So if you put me in a social situation, even one that I like, and I feel that like I've conditioned myself to automatically like mask typical autistic behaviors like alluvial echoing of things that are stuck in my head, right? Stimming, um, and yeah, those two things are like my trademarks, basically. Like I like saying "bing bong" for some reason, and then I found a YouTuber that's like not on the spectrum that also says "bing bong," so that I felt less weird. Um, um, Sometimes I used to like to rock a lot just because it felt comfortable, but then like people, like I was saying before, called me retarded, so I stopped doing it. And like uh, let me think. The other thing I want to clarify is that like there's also this medicalized assumption that people on the spectrum don't have empathy or don't feel emotions, and I wanna I wanna talk about that because I can see where that comes from, and I guess to a certain extent, depending on like what your specific I don't know how to refer to this, but your specific cluster of symptoms, right? Depending on your specific cluster of symptoms, you might not have the cognitive capability to process certain emotions. But that doesn't mean you don't feel emotions, right? So typically, like what I've noticed with people on the spectrum is not a lack of empathy. It's atypical emotional expression. So when someone with autism is feeling sad, they may or may not cry. And if they don't cry, what they might do is go to their room, get very quiet, and turn on a bunch of movies if they love movies. Um, this is one thing that my cousin does when he's sad. He does it all the time, but like you can tell the difference by the rest of his demeanor, right? Like he'll be like, "Oh hey, how you doing?" Like when he talks to you, or like, "Yeah, I was just watching movies. You know, today I was sad." Like, but he won't display neurotypical hallmarks of sadness, but he feels it and he expresses it by like other things. And this is what I've noticed with other people on the spectrum is that emotional expression is often atypical. And so, because of that, for a long time, autism spectrum was characterized as a condition with low empathy, and that's just not true at all. Um, yeah. So the other thing to talk about is ADHD. Uh, so the difficult thing is having both, because both of them have overlapping things. So there's like the thing that autism spectrum and ADHD have in common is the ability to hyperfocus, and hyperfocus is like extreme flow state, right? Let's consider that. It's like extreme. Oh yeah, that leads me to the other thing. Obsession. Obsessions. Mini obsessions. Both have these, right? So, like when I'm really interested in something, I'll probably be interested in something really intensely for like a couple months, maybe longer. It depends on the person. Um, but I know other people that are like this with both ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. Like, uh, it happens with people that have one or both, and when you have both, it's usually really intense. So for me personally, when I get interested in a subject, I tend to like study it really intensely for like 2 or 3 months max. But the thing you have to understand is, like, when I do that, it's like a year's worth of being educated on the topic in like a quarter of the time, because it's the only thing I do for that period. Um, and then I come out of it, and then I realize that I neglected a bunch of other things in my life, and then I feel really guilty. And then people will often say, "Oh, I thought you were going to do thing X because you were really interested in this," and I'm like, "I still am, but I have to go deal with life now." Um, the other thing that I want to talk about with regards to my conditions is major depressive disorder, right? For a long time, I tried to tell myself that, like, oh, yeah, like, I don't have nothing wrong with me. I'm just an irritable ass person. Um, and I mean, anybody can be irritable. Even the nicest people, like, get irritable, right? But, like, depression, first of all, like, experiencing, like, a depression brought about by sadness is different than having depression, right? So having depression, for me, is like trying to do something with like a 50-pound dumbbell on your chest. Like, everything just feels ridiculously heavy. My body is achier than normal when I'm going through a depressive spiral. And I generally experience like a supreme lack of motivation. Like, at its worst, dude, like, I don't even like engaging in hobbies. Like, I just kind of turn something on for background noise and completely zone out for the day. Um, and that's kind of what made me go to the doctor and get the diagnosis, because I've been experiencing that type of thing since I was like 13. And I was reading some stuff about childhood depression, and apparently one of the hallmarks of childhood depression, it's a controversial diagnosis, is that a child will engage in ideation that entails thinking about what the world would be like if they were gone or if they had never existed. And like, I didn't know that, but I used to do that all the time as a kid. And like, it was really interesting to me, but then it also made me feel really like disconnected. And I used to experience like long episodes of like forms of dissociation known as depersonalization and derealization. And I tend to think that those are caused by the depression, as opposed to me having depersonalization or derealization disorder. Because there are, like, normally when I'm not experiencing a depressive spiral, I'm extremely connected to both my body and my surroundings. But when I am in one, it's a struggle to stay grounded. Depression doesn't mean necessarily that you feel sad. It's like trying to do everything wading through a giant pool of mud. And like, there's no way out of the mud until you get to the other side, but it takes so much effort to get to the other side that sometimes you just want to say screw it and like just not. So I mean, that's my answer. I'm sorry these are so long. I thought this was going to be a short stream. I'm trying to remember who asked this. This is a very good question. What are some good things you've noticed? Oh, I know who asked this, because it's very academically asked. It's my dude, David. What are some good things that you've noticed that has come from awareness campaigns and sensitivity training in regards to your or others' specific disabilities? That's a tremendously good question, and I super appreciate it. I'm also conflicted in having to answer this question, right? Because on the one hand, I think awareness campaigns and sensitivity training are wonderful. I've seen firsthand how they've transformed the views of people that work with disabled people, right? So and same thing with awareness campaigns. I've mentioned this book before, right? But if you're interested in disability civil rights going from like the post World War II era through the 90s, there is a book that I suggest you read called No Pity by Joseph A. Shapiro. Dude is a wonderfully compassionate and thorough narrative journalist, and I wish I had his skills. So there's a story from that book that I'm going to tell you in a second, but first I want to talk about the positive sides of these things. So awareness campaigns are cool. Like the green ribbon thing for cerebral palsy awareness, like was not a thing that I knew about until I started meeting other adults actually with CP, because as kids we weren't told about these things. There's a weird sort of tier system in the disabled community, such as it is, right? I'll get into that on another stream, maybe. I got to make some notes on that. I don't know what I think yet. But generally speaking, I think awareness campaigns are good. A point of controversy that I want to talk about in terms of like awareness organizations is Autism Speaks, right? So Autism Speaks markets itself as an advocacy group and a nonprofit that supports research for autism. But what they don't often say is that Autism Speaks is about finding a cure for autism. And I understand that for some people, autism is extremely difficult, right? Like, we all, well, I know families that have children that are severely autistic and engage in self-harming behavior. And they are extremely difficult to help because they get so big and strong that they just like can hurt you really easily and themselves. So there's that. But on the other hand, you have a lot of people on the spectrum who are proud, who have recognized, like, yeah, it's a difficult condition to live with sometimes, but like it also gives you some things that work to your benefit, like the hyperfocus. I knew a dude on the spectrum in high school that I thought was ridiculously cool. His communication was via allelial echoing, right? So he would communicate by repeating things to explain exactly what allelial echoing is. It's when you communicate via things that you've heard, and to you, the person with autism, right, they have a relevance to the situation that you're in. So, like, I knew this guy. He was a senior when I was a freshman. And he, like, let me give you some examples. So when he would make a mistake, he'd be like, sorry, uh-oh, hot dog, right? Because he watched a lot of Mad TV, and Stuart would say, uh-oh, hot dog. And so whenever dude made a mistake, he would say, uh-oh, hot dog. He could type at like 110 words a minute and play the piano by ear. But his communication was limited to what he heard and like what relevance he found to it. So it made communication hard for other people. But if you were patient enough being around him, you knew what his cues were. And it made communication very easy because, like, if you were familiar with the references, you knew what he was saying. It's just an alternate mode of communication, in my opinion. He also signed, and I didn't sign at the time. I do now, but, like, yeah. So, like, Autism Speaks heavily champions something called ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis. It's not really, like, what it sounds to me. I had a friend who used to help with ADA in clinics and stuff, and was also on the spectrum, and they basically try to teach the autistic kid to perform normativity. And speaking from experience as somebody who literally can't because CP, right? Like, there's no way that I can hide my disability, like, chiefly, right? It's exhausting worrying about, like, how your hands are moving, how your legs are moving, how you're speaking, whether or not you're enunciating clearly enough. Are you stimming too much? Can they see? What do they think about it? Like, oh, you're supposed to say these things now. Like, it, it's a lot of work. And, like, I found myself doing it unconsciously because I've done it for so many years, and then I wonder why I'm so tired at the end of the day. So just bear that in mind. But on the plus side, they have raised awareness for conditions that otherwise wouldn't be talked about, like autism, right? There is a pro-autism group called ASAN that I highly recommend you check out because it was pioneered by people on the spectrum to advocate for themselves as an alternative to Autism Speaks. I would super duper recommend that you check that out as an alternative to Autism Speaks. And if you would like to talk to someone on the spectrum, right? Get to know someone that's an adult. Get to know some of the challenges they've had. I'm sure you guys can find a way around some stuff. The downside actually has to do with the Jerry Lewis Telethon. So I was reading, for those of you who don't know, the Jerry Lewis Telethon used to be a thing, and it used to be a way to raise money for people with muscular dystrophy. And there's a story in Joseph A. Shapiro's book about just that. So, muscular dystrophy is a neurodegenerative, it's a muscular atrophy disorder, actually, that's progressive. So at the time, this dude was a kid, walked up on stage with crutches, and then fell over, and then he made a face because he was about to cry because he's like 9 years old, and he fell in front of like millions of people. Jerry Lewis kindly helped him up, right? And got on with the show. But there were a bunch of people that took an image of him in that fallen state, and they used it for other purposes. And it was used in a derogatory way. And from that he learned, or she, I don't remember which, but learned that you have to be very careful as someone with a disability to manage your image. And that's something we all still have to deal with. You think that this is something just for like Instagram models and YouTubers, but like when you have a condition that like sort of makes you auto different, it's a part of your daily life. I feel like I'm constantly managing my image in every place but home, but now that I live with someone that I really don't know, I'm also like I tried to manage my image before too. It just whatever, it didn't work out. What do you think are some abilities and advantages? Oh yeah, I said I was gonna. What do you think are some abilities and advantages that your condition has afforded you? Are there things you particularly value that you wouldn't have known otherwise if you didn't have a disability? This is a difficult question. Give me a second. So let me explain why this is difficult. Because all my life I've been told that I would be different if I didn't have a disability by people that don't have disabilities. So let me start there and see where this goes. So one thing that I was told is that I wouldn't be that intellectual if I didn't have a disability. I was told that I have an easy life because I don't really have to do anything because I have a disability. And I could just, sit on my butt and collect SSI. I've been told that it's pretty sweet when you just live at home and you don't have to worry about, bills and shit. These are actual quotes from people, dude. Like, I'm not making this up, so don't think that I'm just trying to garner sympathy. These are things that I have a very difficult time hearing. Um, so very rarely have I ever met someone with a disability who just genuinely wants to collect SSI, right? In fact, I'm working to try to get off of it soon because I would like to retire like a normal human being and travel the world. And honestly, SSI does not afford you the greatest of opportunities to achieve these things. Like, I really want to see a bunch of other countries before I die. So yeah. Um, but on the plus side, right? Like, oftentimes in grocery lines, people will allow me to cut if I'm in the disability accessible lane. Sometimes I've had checkers actually ask that customers move so they can check me out first. Um, customer service counters are cool. Cutting the lines at amusement parks is cool. I, I hesitate to call educational accommodations an advantage. But for the sake of argument, I'm just going to go ahead and put it in there, like with an asterisk. Um, so, like, honestly, from my personal point of view, like, aside from the things that I just mentioned, no. Um, I think a lot of people take their mobility and their ability to exercise that freely completely for granted. And I think that knowing who I am, if I had been born without CP, because that's the only thing I knew I had for years, I would have still been equally as intellectually curious. I just would have also been more inclined to physical activity. Um, I'm not ashamed of my disability, but I do think my life would be easier if I didn't have it. So yeah, that's gonna be my answer. Yeah. What do people wrongly assume about you? I think I answered this one actually. Um, but this opens another avenue for talking about some misconception that people often have about people with disabilities, and that is, that idea of the asexual, like, disabled saint, right? So, like, people with disabilities don't want physically intimate companionship or don't have the desire for that. And, like, dude, honestly, that's blatantly, like, just not even true, like, whatsoever. Um, and people have assumed the same thing about me until they get to know me. And they're like, dude, you're kind of perverted. And I'm like, I know. Because I am on SSI, people assume I don't want to work, which isn't true. It's just really difficult to find jobs that are willing to hire me and also make reasonable accommodations, because a lot of it, going back to the discrimination in the workplace, like, um, I've been hired for jobs and then been given no accommodation to do them and then let go because I couldn't adequately perform the job, despite the fact that I talked to my employer about the things that I would need to do this job well, and in fact, more efficiently than a lot of their able-bodied employees do the work. Um, um, So there's that. Um, yeah, that's the biggest one. And the other thing is like, what is it? How do I put this? Just that I'm cool with being inspiration porn is an assumption people make. And for those of you who don't know what inspiration porn is, it falls into a couple categories. According to Wikipedia, Stella Young coined the term in an essay she wrote for an Australian newspaper before she passed away. But I vaguely remember hearing it before I ran into her, so I'm not entirely sure. Um, Inspiration porn to me is a form of fetishization of people with disabilities as objects of inspiration or pity in order to make yourself feel good or to help you imagine, oh, you could always have it worse. Um, One of the common forms that this takes is, oh, it's really good to see someone in your condition, like up and around and like doing things. And I'm like, what? Like wiping my butt and putting on clothes and going outside? Like, the point is, like, celebrate me for the things I accomplished the same way that you would anyone else, not just because, uh, to use, I think it was Dylan and Cole Sprouse and Big Daddy, right? Like that line, I can wipe my own ass, I can wipe my own ass. Don't celebrate me for that. Um, I mean, there are people that can't, and I assume that, like, for them, that would be celebration. But for me, dude, it's normal. Like, I just do it differently than you do. I just do certain things differently, but most of the things that you can do, I can do. And in a lot of ways, I've had to exercise more creativity with how I do things because of my physical limitations. Um, I mean, so yeah. Next question. I think we're almost done, and then maybe I'll find one of those ADA at 30 articles. Because, oh no, we're not almost done. These are really big questions. All right, never mind. What do you wish people knew about living life with a disability? So many things. Even though, like in my case, like cerebral palsy is a condition that is not degenerative, it is not progressive, right? Meaning that it doesn't get worse over time. But like everyone else, your body does deteriorate over time, and because you have CP, that will affect you differently. Um, it's important to know that for anyone with any kind of disability, every day is different. Your body and mind are going to feel different on a daily basis, and people have really shitty days. And when you have a disability, sometimes they're like uber shitty. Um, in my stream about stoicism, I talked about how I learned to localize pain because of a dislocated hip at a young age because I had to stop taking Darvocet because I was becoming addicted to them. I just told my mom I didn't like the medication and it didn't work. The truth was I liked it too much. And I found myself trying to take it when I wasn't supposed to take it. And I had to like fight that. And later, like I actually ended up having problems with Vicodin later in life. Because it makes you feel good. But like I learned to localize pain to such an extent that like my my brain automatically interprets most kinds of daily pain that I feel as like pressure or heaviness now. So I don't feel pain the way a lot of other people do anymore because I've like mentally localized pain for so long that it just like converted. But sometimes what will happen, like right after I wake up, is that my body will be super heavy and I'll be ridiculously irritable until two things happen. Um, like I spend at least 30 minutes like meditating, and B, I have coffee. Because it does enough to like energize my mind that like I can go back to auto localizing my sensation of pain. Another thing that I want people to know about living with a disability, whether you want to believe it or not, people look at you differently than they do with everyone else. Um, Even as people out there watching this who do not have a disability, I need you to understand. You do look at me differently because I have a disability. The question is whether that bias is more positive or more negative, and then what is the nature of that bias, right? But to pretend that the bias doesn't exist and that you don't see it does two things, in my opinion. It does a disservice to me because you're discounting a large part of my daily experience. Not that it defines me, but like to discount it is a whole nother matter, right? The other thing is it does you a disservice because you're not giving yourself the opportunity to acknowledge a cognitive bias, and you're not giving yourself an opportunity to learn from it. Um, the other thing is that forming romantic partnerships as someone with a disability is excruciatingly difficult. Um, I talked earlier about the difference between like uh, trying to meet someone in person versus when I used the chat line to make romantic connections as a teenager because my friend would go on there and give out my number. And then he convinced me to go on, and I did pretty well for myself in that regard. Um, Online dating for me has been near impossible. Um, I get almost no responses, especially if I take a picture of myself in a wheelchair. Um, and I talked about this before, but there was a period of my life when I went down a Reddit rabbit hole researching my book, The Gimpy Monologues, right? And I found that so many people on that forum were averse to even the idea of dating someone with a disability. And some of these people were people that had siblings with disabilities that ranged from extremely mild to very severe. And most of them were like, ew, that's disgusting. Why would I ever want to do that? And it was really depressing, dude. And I need people to acknowledge that these attitudes exist everywhere, and the seeds of them exist in all of us. They just change shape, right? But the first thing we need to do to like get rid of them is to acknowledge them and then like counteract them in a way that they don't grow into even stronger biases. I mean, that's just what I think. Um, I answered the questions about language together, so I'm going to skip that. So this gives away my geographic location, my brother, but I love you. Okay. What do you feel Sacramento needs to do the most improvement on in terms of how it helps people with disabilities? Like, if you had to grade this city on how easy or difficult it is to get around due to issues in buildings or public transit or whatever, how would you grade it? A hard C plus. That's to start with a grade. But part of it isn't the city's fault, right? What part of it is the lax nature of federal regulation around disability. What I mean by that is that there are certain public venues in this city that are also considered historical landmarks, which by their very nature are exempt from needing to comply with ADA, which means they're not required to put in ramps. They're not required to widen doorways so that people in wheelchairs can fit. They're not required to have accessible restrooms. Um, Also, the regulation around accessible housing is so crappy on a federal level that the state and city implementations of it are even more horrid. So, for like something around a 200 unit complex, they're only required to have like two accessible units. And let me give you an idea of what this looks like, right? Again, this is a thing that happened to me. So my brother used to live in this apartment complex, and he was like, "Yeah, it's kind of ghetto, but it's fairly cheap right now." And like, you know, I needed an apartment, so I went and I filled out an application, and they said all of their accessible units are occupied. And I was like, "Oh, really? I didn't even know you had any. Where are those at?" So she walked me over to them, dudes, and what I saw was appalling. They weren't really accessible apartments. One dude was on crutches, so he didn't really need physical accommodations to get to his apartment, and the other dude was in a wheelchair. So let me tell you about the dude's apartment in a wheelchair, right? It was just a standard apartment, and he had to leave his back door unlocked so he could go in through the back because the front had steps. That was considered accessible. And according to the law, they were not violating the ADA. Let me repeat that for those of you that did not hear what I just said. According to the law, that was not in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. The law went into effect in 1992, and that is considered acceptable accommodation. So this is why I give the city of Sacramento a C plus. A, because historical buildings aren't required. Like, it's not the city's fault, but it is something they could do if they wanted, right? Because I have a friend who, early on in his career, wanted to open a tea shop, and he found a really cool location in Midtown, right? And it was a cool historical building, and he loved it. And then he had friends that was like, "Bro, I can't get in your thing. I can't get in your freaking establishment, my dude." And he was like, "Oh shit, I didn't even think about wheelchair accessibility." Like, and the city has no, like, they don't tell you anything about that. And so, like, and the other thing that I would want to criticize Sacramento on hard is the attitude of your public transit drivers around driving people in wheelchairs. Let me explain this. I have been told on numerous occasions by one woman specifically who actually used to drive paratransit. And this is what made me so angry, right? So like, first of all, let me give you the solution to the problem I'm about to describe. You put these people in wheelchairs and you make them ride your goddamn buses in wheelchairs so they understand what it's like when the driver doesn't care about how they load or unload or tie down a chair. Okay? That's the solution. Period. It's cheap. You can do it right now. Do it. Do it now. So here's the problem. I used to live on Howe Avenue. That's pretty close to the only mall that still exists that's not in Roseville. For those of you that are local, it's Arden Fair. I used to live within walking distance of Arden Fair. There was a bus stop straight across the street from my apartment. I was going downtown one evening to meet with some friends, and this woman had parked in such a way that made the access ramp on the bus steeper than it should have been given the location she was at. And I was like, "Hey, can I get some help up the ramp?" And I heard like four different people yelling, like, "Why don't you get up and fucking help them?" And you know what she told me? And I quote, "I'm not fucking paratransit." All right? So, public transit, you get a hard F for that one instance because it was a repeat offense. That should not happen to anyone. You need to train your drivers on how to properly tie down various kinds of wheelchairs. I will volunteer myself because some of you that are driving buses don't understand what the frame of a wheelchair is. You just equate to it's metal, it's the frame. That is not the case. There are the wheels, there are the spokes, there is the axle. There are several metal moving parts on a chair that you should not attach a tie down to. So when it comes to public transit, you get a hard F because most drivers don't care if they tie you down safely. They just put some straps on you, call it good and run. Because why? Because you're too worried about your schedule and they don't care enough to be late and do it properly. Even though I know that every time you pick up someone with a disability, you have to call it in. There's a specific code you use, and it's different between Elk Grove and Sacramento, but there's a specific code you use to identify that pickup so dispatch knows. So if you're going to take the time to do that, give proper customer service because it's about safety. That's why you get a hard C, Sacramento. Shitty, affordable, accessible housing. No access to historical buildings. And shitty customer service when it comes to public transit. Your public buildings are fine. In general, the city is helpful toward people with disabilities, but in those three areas, you are failing miserably. Yeah, I mean, I got a little angry at that, but like, it's the truth, dudes. You're failing at those three things. And I'm being generous because I still gave you a C+. Like, if you have 3 Fs on a report card of 6 classes, you're not going to get a C. Average. More than likely, unless you have 3 As. Right? So, I really, really hope that this stream has been educational. I had tons of freaking fun answering all these questions. I will be doing another Disability AMA next week. Same bad time, same bad channel. I love you all. I'm about to go review a movie that a friend of mine put out. Support your local filmmakers and arts communities. We are all struggling because of COVIDs. And quite frankly, we need help. I actually want to write a book, another book, that interviews people with disabilities and talks about these very same kinds of questions. I haven't quite figured out the format, but I may start a crowdfunding campaign to help me pay for the cost of getting it published. So if you're interested, I will be giving more information about that in the future. I sort of kind of decided that well, you know what, dudes? You know what? Let's do another ADA at 30 article, New York Times. All right, let's do one, and let's close it out with that. I want to leave it on like a hopeful note, right? So let's do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for a New York Times article with audio. I'm going to be streaming the audio. And then I'm going to let's see if this one has audio. Computer-generated audio recording. All right, so yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do this one. So what we're going to do is listen to the audio recording. I'm going to respond to it, and then we're going to wrap things up so I can go get to some other business. All right. Let's do the Sherry share. Audio, Chrome tab. Okay, let me make sure this looks right on the stream for us. See, I have this problem before. We're gonna spotlight that. Dude, I keep switching it and it doesn't switch. All right. Okay. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn off this title and we're going to read this article together. I'm going to have the audio play.
We should celebrate. But there is still work to do. This essay is based on an interview of Judy Heumann by Caitlin Wells. Ms. Heumann is the co-author of Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist, with Kristen Joyner, and is featured in the award-winning Netflix documentary Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution. I was 18 months old when my parents learned I had polio. It was 1949, and things that were typical for children were not so typical for me. I was denied the right to go to school because the staff did not know how to accommodate a student who could not walk. Instead, I received just 2.5 hours of home instruction each week. People like me who did not fit into a neat little box had no laws to protect. We were not advancing in our education and no one had expectations for our futures. This discrimination continued when I pursued my teaching career. Though I passed all my exams, I was denied a teaching license in 1970 because New York City's Board of Education thought I could not safely evacuate my students in case of a fire. There was no one who looked like me, who used a wheelchair, fighting for this right. I filed a lawsuit and I won. I began to see other disabled people fighting for inclusion, and I found empowerment in our collaboration. On April 5, 1997, more than 100 of us occupied a San Francisco federal building for what became known as the 504 sit-in. We had fought with the Carter administration to sign regulations implementing Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which prohibited programs that received federal funding from discriminating against disabled people, but after years of asking, 504 still had not been signed. We occupied the building for almost a month until our demands were met. Section 504 was key because it laid the foundation for the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA helped open building doors, allowed us to earn an education and made it illegal to discriminate against a qualified person for employment. We should celebrate the strides we have made. But there is still work to do. The way society thinks about disability needs to evolve, as too many people view disability as something to loathe or fear. By changing this mentality, by recognizing how disabled people enrich our communities, we can all be empowered to make sure disabled people are included.
Oh, that's it. Oh, crap. Davey the song. That was a really good question, dude. Because, this article actually made me think of your question again. So, I want to, frame protest as an aggressive form of awareness campaign. And here's why. Because sometimes people don't recognize something as a problem unless we as people make the existence of that problem inconvenient for the people that don't see it. And without people like Judy Heumann and Paul K. Longmore, Art Honeyman, Dr. Richard Pimentel, people like that, my deaf studies teacher, Kim Harrell, we're not going to get anywhere. Because if it's one thing, watching society has taught me, it's that a certain segment of the population isn't going to acknowledge that something is an issue until it becomes an issue for them. So sometimes you have to make it an issue for society at large to get any real damage done, to make a dent in the issue. And without people like that, I wouldn't have the rights that I do. And I am eternally grateful and humbled by the men, women, and children who showed up 13 years before I was born and even earlier, so that by the time I showed up, people would begin to recognize that I was also human. I owe a serious, deep, and eternal debt of gratitude to all of those people. And I see it as my personal mission to contribute to further benefiting people who are still struggling with a lot of these issues. Because I want to make you aware that just because we got Section 504, by the way, like, I don't know if you guys know this, but the ADA was met with huge, huge criticisms. Next week, I'm going to show you guys a short video on the different parts of the ADA. It's like 3 minutes. I originally had it planned for today, and then I ended up with a lot more questions than I thought I would have, and then I also forgot that I need to do a couple things, so yeah, this is going to be shorter than normal. But I want to talk about the ADA in more detail, but that also means I have to sit down and reread it and like listen to a bunch of explanations. So for the time being, no. Section 504 was originally put on Nixon's desk, and he refused to sign it. Carter came into office and did the same thing. But as a result of the sit-in, the Carter administration had sent a liaison down to the sit-in to try to like quell it, right? And he was so put off by all of the people's conditions that he locked himself in an office, and the dude that came with him was like, bro, get the hell out, pull your head out your butt, and come listen to these people. Because I've been sitting there listening to them for the last hour, and they have something they need to freaking tell you. And they dragged his butt out of that office. He heard what they were saying. He argued with them. They spoke again. He heard it, and he was like, all right, this is something we really need to do something about. And if it hadn't been for that type of action, mind you, there were people that needed medical equipment, that needed respirators, that needed medication, that endangered their lives so that we could have Section 504 and later the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? Every major, large-scale social movement that's worth having means that people are going to risk something in order to see that change. And up until very recently, I've been living a fairly low-risk existence. And, luckily Twitch allows me to be outside when I'm not outside. But you guys need to understand, like, this didn't come just by people, like, quietly, like, posting shit on Facebook. Like, social media would not have made that type of movement any less drastic than it was when it took place. Because, let's face it, people just engage in an infinite scroll, and sometimes you have to go outside and make shit happen. Yeah, dudes, like, that's kind of what I want to leave you with. If there's something you are really passionate about, start doing something about it. We need people doing something about the things they care about. And if you happen to be on the losing side of history, you got to talk to the people who are winning. And maybe your view is wrong, maybe their view is not correct. But, like, to me, first of all, I found out I'm a pacifist, so I'm not down with violent protest. It makes for great movies, but it makes for a tremendous loss of life. I'm not going to say waste of life, but it makes for a tremendous loss of life and loss of livelihood. One that I would prefer not to see, and I think we can do better. But I do think political action is necessary. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. I have to go edit video now. I'll see you next week. Bye.